Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Trials Evolution of Extreme Metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka in this house, Joe Frankulin is a hero.
And I am the black metal guy, aka I don't have an aka today.
Oh, that's cruel. Alright, fine. We'll continue anyway.
I played that. I played that horrible card. Oh wait, no, I have one. Let's redo it.
No, go for it. Just say it now.
I'm the black metal guy, aka Insanity Wolf Comeback.
You saw the conversation about advice animals in the Discord the other day?
No, I actually didn't. See, this means it's going to happen. There's a stirring in the weave of fate.
Dude, maybe that's the thing. We create like an apparel brand of t-shirts with nothing but like horrible like mid-2000s like early meme culture stuff. Mm-hmm. But, like, I don't know, as all-over prints or something, and I bet we can get the Zoomers. No, we were talking about it in the Discord because...
Don't you think, like, Hot Topic must have printed a bunch of Insanity Wolf t-shirts?
Probably something like that. But
yeah.
It came up in the Discord because we were educating our resident Marxist Zoomer about, like, mid-2000s meme culture, so we were just sharing, like... horrible advice animal stuff, the Power Thirst video, shit like that. Newground stuff from 04.
He didn't know Insanity Wolf?
He wasn't alive when it came out, my man.
I just thought it might have been sort of memorialized in the hall of, like, dead memes.
I don't know. Well, that one didn't...
That's up there with lolcats, man.
Yeah, or the Oh Really Owl.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so real quick, just as a little preamble, some of you guys who weren't around for the Terminus Omega live stream might be wondering what the deal is with the episode that you have here. And you're probably doubly confused if you saw the long video game critique that I put out a couple weeks ago here on the channel. Well, for anyone who wasn't there, we'll get you up to speed. So here on Terminus, we have decided to expand our palette a little bit. After declaring total merciless war on extreme metal journalism for half a decade now, we have decided to spread our wings, so to speak. So we will periodically be covering new records, but we're expanding a lot. We're going to be doing more material about old classic material, like on this episode here, stuff about games, stuff about books, sort of like getting more broadly into media and culture. And myself and the black metal guy both have our own plans for sort of individualized contributions. In, sort of different far-flung fields that are of interest to us. But we are going to be here providing regular doses of extreme metal content. So, for any of you that were curious about that, you're going to be hearing a lot more of us opining on old classics, or maybe just old records we want to talk about that aren't classics to anyone but ourselves. And with that in mind... we would like to offer you the opportunity, as usual, to not follow us on social media, because that is done and dusted, boys. We are not doing... we are not...
Death metal guy.
Yeah?
I figured out what I'm going to do with it.
What?
I feel like actually nuking the Instagram is probably too dramatic. What I should do is just put... I'm still going to put our fucking year-end lists on it. I've been meaning to do that for a month. And then after I do that, I'm going to do a placeholder post that says, I'm not checking this page anymore. Right? I reserve the right to log in every 6 months or something, right? Maybe. But, like, this is not the best way to reach us. I will not be doing new posts. Like, every once in a while I might pop on. But it is to expect no regular social media content henceforth. My thinking is that basically, like, it's a useful placeholder because people randomly find their way to the show through Instagram all the time.
Okay, that's fair. So,
yeah.
Feel free to follow or not follow the black metal guy on Instagram at Terminus Extreme Metal. And, So if you do want to get in touch with us, feel free to email us at thetrueterminus@gmail.com. Comment on YouTube, which is going to be sort of our home base for the foreseeable future, or if you still feel the need for parasocial interaction and you want to revisit all the greatest memes of 2005, subscribe to us on Patreon, where $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, where you can post Insanity Wolf and no one will judge you. And this is especially useful. I'm going to pitch this a little bit harder because, again, we've got tons of new kinds of content coming out. We're really redoubling our efforts to produce what we think is some of the best really music and media in general criticism out there today. And I think that the YouTube channel is probably permanently unable to be monetized, and if it isn't yet, it certainly will be with some of the material that I'm going to be releasing in the near future. So every little bit helps, guys. You know, for only a few cents a day, you can feed a hungry death metal guy and black metal guy.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, in keeping with our new format, our first episode of 2025 is going to be covering a band that is near and dear to our hearts, and if it isn't already, hopefully soon your hearts as well. We are today going to be talking about the maybe not infamous, but sort of operating in a weird realm of like obscurity but general appreciation, Niden Division 187. For those unfamiliar, Niden Division 187 was a short-lived Swedish black metal project that sort of ends up being kind of a retroactive supergroup featuring the vocalist and drummer from Dawn, one of the guitarists from A Canorous Quintet, and the bassist from Thy Primordial. They had a very short discography, one demo and an EP that is merely the demo remixed in 1996, and their only full length in 1997. Typically, the way that you would usually find this is collected as sort of a discography piece in the form of Impergium/Towards Judgment. And this is a band that I've been listening to since high school, and I've been listening to a lot more lately because they're a very singular project that I think people knew better and talked about more in kind of like the period where the black metal guy and I were getting into metal back in the 2000s. But, you know, they've slipped a little bit away from the public zeitgeist, and I think that's kind of a tragedy because, you know, if I really think about it, I think that this might be one of my favorite black metal bands of all time, and the sort of combined record Impergium Towards Judgment might be one of my favorite black metal records of all time, which is interesting because before we started recording, me and the black metal guy were talking, and I said, you know, what I think is fascinating about Niden Division 187 is that Impergium is probably nobody's favorite black metal record, but I bet if you pressed a bunch of people that were very serious black metal fans, it's probably in their top 20.
Yeah, it's probably top 20 for me.
Yeah, so,
it's
like, what?
And, in fact, the guy who uploaded the collection we used on YouTube, Snare Desecrator, it is his favorite black metal record of all time.
And, you know, if somebody said that, that's like, it's a weird choice, but it's kind of valid. You know?
It's a very, yes, I think it is a very valid choice. Because, in a way, this record has a strange way of, yeah, I mean, for you, right, you listen to it a lot, but you would never have, until you were thinking about it for this episode, you would never have thought of it as one of your favorite black metal records. For me, it's always one of those records I, like, should listen to more than I do. I listen to it somewhat. I remember I got it on Bandcamp a while back so I could listen to it on headphones, which was nice. But it's one of those records I love, but don't listen to that much. So it ends up in that kind of nether territory for a lot of people. And it's because there's something tremendously niche about this album, even though, when you look at it, it really does everything you would want a great black metal record album to do.
Yeah. It is... I guess... So what are the limiting factors of Niden Division 187? Well, one, it's extremely harsh and minimal, although not as minimal as it seems at first blush. The production is deliberately raw and thin, and
but kind of warm, I would say. The guitar tone is warm and buzzy.
Yeah, and it's it is sort of mercilessly misanthropic. It is. I think that perhaps one of the reasons that this has fallen out of favor to a certain degree is that black metal has expanded its emotional palette, shall we say, so much in the intervening years. This is not this is not that sort of band. This is a band that is about war and death and suffering exclusively. It is extremely angry and extremely bitter and cruel in a way that is perhaps more distinctive now than it was when it was released.
Yes, and with that is, I think, another one of the limiting factors that goes with that is the depressive affect. Mm-hmm. The whole record, like, you could call this a DSBM record.
Yes.
It would be the most violent DSBM record of all time, but it you could say that. There's also a guy who does a whole Dawn review where he talks about Dawn as the ultimate music of depression, and I think he's missing some pieces there, but, like, he's kind of right. There's a profoundly bleak quality to this group of bands. And to Niden, it's in concentrated form in Niden. There is the ethos here is inhumanity, right? And there's a glorification of titanic forces that shatter and restructure the world, right? So, especially war. But that there's also a consciousness that this involves a lot of suffering.
Is Niden Division potentially the most Ernst Jünger black metal band that ever existed?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. It is the most Ernst Jünger. Yes. This is, On Pain, Storm of Steel, The Worker, early Ernst Jünger, absolutely. Yes. This is also when we talk about severity in, like, say, Spite Extreme Wing. I feel like even when we did the Spite Extreme Wing review, what my example for it was, like, severity, like in Niden. This is it for a whole record, right? How do you have, like, primarily consonant riffing that still creates a sense of cutting through things, clear separation, hurling contempt from on high? This is it.
Yeah, this is intensely scowling and elitist music in the best way possible. Let's rewind briefly, though, because you brought up Dawn, which I think is an important part of, again, why this band might be a little bit forgotten. So, Niden is popularly understood as a side project of Dawn, which is fair to a degree, because it features the vocalist and drummer from Dawn. But half the band is not coming from Dawn. Leo Pignon from A Canaris Quintet is the guitarist, and Jonas Albrechtsen from then Thy Primordial is the bassist. There's, as far as I can tell, only one extant interview available regarding Niden Division, which is with Henrik Forss, the vocalist, where he describes it as a sort of side project of Dawn. And I think that might be kind of where this idea comes from. But if we look at the actual timeline of all these different bands, well, Dawn had their first full-length out by the time Niden was on the scene. But Niden's work in 96 and 97 is contemporary with the first full-lengths of Thy Primordial and a Canarus Quintet. So to suggest that this is really just a side project, a sort of super group amongst Swedish friends doing something together, doesn't really seem accurate, especially because in that interview, I think there's two interviews with Henrik Fors, actually. One is sort of a combined Dawn and Niden interview, and one's just about Niden Division. In the combined Dawn Niden interview, he talks about how there was actually a second album planned, where they already had something like 10 songs written that just sort of never materialized, probably for the same reason that a third Dawn album has never materialized, So, but I bring this up because Niden, because it's always been considered a sort of side project of these other better known bands, has never really been perceived as something that's like worth investigating on its own. I think that most of the people that are investigating Niden Division these days are probably like Dawn fans who want to check other stuff out. But like, even if you're not into Dawn, there's reasons you should be checking out Niden Division.
I feel like Niden is better known than Thy Primordial. I didn't even listen. I'm a huge fan of both of these bands, and I didn't even really know about Thy Primordial till some of our friends, probably on Hessian Firm, started talking about them.
Well, Thy Primordial and a Canarus Quintet actually are both. And here's another reason that Niden aren't that well known, these are bands that were coming out in sort of the dark ages of black and death metal. Mm-hmm. Thy Primordial's work is primarily in the late 90s and early 2000s. Same with the Canarus Quintet. And Niden Division also. Niden Division puts out their material in 96 and 97 after the second wave is done and dusted. Just sort of operating on their own while the future of black metal is completely uncertain. And as a result, they're just one of those bands that put out what I would consider a classic record that suffers from just being in the wrong time and the wrong place.
Yeah, well, these bands were, I think you could say that to some extent of all of them. Dawn are now better known, I think mostly thanks to YouTube, but they're still, arguably in terms of talent, if you take these four bands, all of which shared members to some degree, and all of which had different songwriters on guitar. That's the important thing, right? The guy doing guitars on Niden is not the guy doing guitars on Dawn, mm-hmm. right? It's the Canarus Quintet guy, and then Thy Primordial has their own guitarist. So there was a tremendous range of songwriting power in these bands, and you can hear how they all strongly resemble each other in certain ways, but they all have their own personalities. Because it's happening later in the 90s, they're never going to get the rep of like Dissection, right? And in many ways they're indebted to Dissection, but I like it a lot better. Mm-hmm. And I think all four of these bands are part of a process, especially Dawn and Niden, but Thy Primordial too, where you have the reason the scene never got huge, I think, is it partly that they didn't have a gimmick? Mm-hmm. Right? There was no kind of, and I don't even mean gimmick there was no drama surrounding them. There wasn't they didn't attempt to directly create their own black circle, right? The scene was never formalized in any way. Yeah. It didn't have kind of an image or a brand.
Yeah, there's no hyper-distinct aesthetic thing to hang your hat on.
Right. If there's a thing that you can... Yes. And the thing that they're doing is, which I think is artistically mature and ahead of its time, is also hard to brand, which is they're taking the ethos of 90s Norwegian and Swedish satanic black metal and removing the trappings of fantasy Satanism. So that what you end up with is music that is, just about, vast and sublime forces, just about militarism, just about, in the case of Thy Primordial, just about kind of like visionary transport, or, insight into ethereal realms. You end up like all of this stuff, they're sort of abstracting from the original black metal formula and getting to its essence, which is also harder to market. Harder to market, but much more like directly making contact with the modern world.
Which is kind of funny because, like, of all these bands, Niden is sort of the one with the most distinct aesthetic. You know,
that's true.
It just wouldn't really have a sort of a groundswell of public support behind it until much later, because Niden sort of resembles stuff that would be released on like Van Records or Iron Bonehead much later down the road,
or the first roster of the first and much better roster of Invictus bands, I think.
Yeah.
Right. Niden is an epic war metal band, but Invictus would start releasing that stuff mostly from Irish and Anglo bands. Niden's also an odd fish out because it is Scandinavian war metal. And there's only one other example of that we can think most people know, which is Marduk, who are one of the biggest black metal bands ever. The other people who would have influenced Niden at this time would be like Zyklon, who I don't know well at all.
Oh, Zyklon-B.
But Zyklon-B, right, before Zyklon, yes. Yeah. Zyklon-B is like the number one comparative reference point on Metal Archives. And then, like War was also around then.
Yeah, I was actually listening to Zyklon-B's Blood Must Be Shed probably for the first time ever the other day, and I was struck by how it's really good. Dude, it's like really good, and it's actually one of the only things that is sort of musically comparable to Niden.
Yeah, well, so this is part of it's part of this small circle of like Gotaland bands, and then it's also part of this micro aesthetic of like I don't know, Scandinavian war metal with Zyklon and Marduk.
Well, I think
that's it.
That distinction of this functioning sort of like war metal is important, because that's really an important part of the musical DNA here. Niden is 100% a black metal band, but there's massive amounts of death metal and especially grindcore.
Yes, lots of grindcore.
Lots of grindcore. Like, you could call this black grind, and I wouldn't bat an eye.
Actually, the guitar tone is kind of like Scum.
Yeah, it is.
Some of the riffs are like Scum. Yeah.
Yeah, and also it's Scum, and it's like old Deicide. Actually, there's a lot of like old Deicide sort of riffs on this, and it's hard to tell because the production is so thin and compressed. But if you just sort of beef it out, you've got like mid-90s Deicide riffs dotting this thing all over the place, which is interesting, and it's interesting how they managed to make it work in this context so effectively. What's also really interesting, because I was doing my research for this episode and reading those interviews with Henrik Force, he mentioned, and I don't know why I'd never considered this, but it makes perfect sense, that Impergium was written and recorded in 2 weeks. Which just, of course it was. It's so it has such an immediacy to it.
Yes, it is very off the cuff.
If they had spent 6 weeks on the record, it would have sucked. And maybe that's why they didn't keep it going, is because the immediacy and the violence of this music is so crucial to it that, like, maybe this is a band that couldn't possibly live for more than a couple years.
Yeah.
So I guess I guess we should probably get into playing some stuff, because I think there's a lot of interesting musical stuff to point out. So for another just quick thing for everyone, the way most people have heard Niden Division is in the combined Impergium Towards Judgment CD. That's the hard copy that I used to have, which is like a little bit expensive now. It's like $30 or so on Discogs to get a copy of it. So we're going to be sampling sort of interchangeably between those things, or maybe a little bit of stuff from the demo. We're using a YouTube link of the full discography re-release that was recently put out, which is just a really cool item. And, if you can snag a copy for a decent price, I highly recommend it. But, we're going to refer to this largely as Impergium, but we're talking about the whole discography. So let's start with the second track, which is sort of the first full song on the Impergium record, titled Genocide. And it's gonna start with sort of a brutish deicide riff. It's gonna work through a few things, and then it's gonna hit one of those incredible melodic peaks that Niden is probably best known for. Okay,
we're 2 years before Panzer.
So a lot of stuff happens there. And okay, so this occurs to me now. I don't know why I never put this together. That enormous melodic riff there, this must have been foundational for Senor Voland.
You would think, right? You would think. I wonder if that's just assuming everyone cares about exactly the things we do, but this
they should.
They should. This has to be, that's just...
That is a chivalric French black metal riff.
It is. And it has the sort of more grim tone in the Senor Voland version. Kristallnacht did not exist, or barely existed at this point.
And they were not doing anything nearly that sophisticated.
No, they couldn't play those riffs.
Yeah.
97, there was a split in 97, which is the year this comes out, so I'm going to count this as well ahead of Kristallnacht. I was also realizing, as I belatedly listened through a lot of the GBK discography, right? When I was listening to Mocking the Philanthropist the other day, I was like, oh, that has to be big for the French, right? Maybe the game of telephone really starts with Galal riffs go to France because they're following him because of the skinhead scene, and then the Finns pick them up from the French, etc. But this sounds way more. But Galal stuff doesn't exactly sound like Seigneur Volant.
Oh, right? No. Yeah,
you can hear there's certain riffs on Mocking where you can hear how that would translate into a French context. But this just is like a piece of something from the 2000s.
It's remarkably ahead of its time, and
yes.
And something I also want to note. So I mean, there's several things to talk about here, but that melodic riff is obviously a highlight. It's a highlight of the whole record, and they just whip it out on the first song, basically. What's fascinating is that it's this very simple, like, reverse chord shape, descending line with just 4 chords the first time around, and then when the vocals and drums kick in, a more elaborate, sort of folky version of it is played, which is an extremely sophisticated technique for this time and place, which sort of informs you of the sort of like melodeath pedigree of a lot of this band. That's the thing about Niden that's so fascinating, is that at first blush it seems like this incredibly raw and minimal black metal record, which it is, but within it are all these like very important and subtle musical decisions that are made that are informed by these guys playing in much more outwardly sophisticated bands alongside it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I almost would say the opposite. I feel like a lot of these sophisticated ideas people don't try anymore.
Oh,
right?
that's fair. Yeah.
Like, there was a kind of ambition that a band like this had that is before a certain kind of formula gets invented. I see what you mean in that, of course, there are now very sort of technical black metal bands in a way that maybe there weren't in the 90s, but like the like if we're comparing Niden to stuff that kind of sounds like Niden now, whether it's melodic French black metal or war metal, I feel like Niden were trying way more interesting things compositionally. I think the middle of that sample also was really cool. There's this you have that initial riff rolling in. I definitely, you were comparing it to Deicide. I was comparing it to Siege of Power. Then you have the Stuka Dive Bomber riffs, which are awesome. And then it lights into this riff, this trem riff that kind of it's a very high tension trem riff that works to sort of bridge the two parts of the song. It gets us to the big melodic riff, and that this sort of bridging riff has a really interesting shape. It's like there's a first phrase which is hybrid. There's like it has a very different set of chords and like harmonic colors than the first. Like the second half feels very different from the first, basically. And then the rest of the riff, there's a whole second phrase that works based on the second half of the first phrase. And it ends up, and it creates one long riff that ends up going on for a very long time and then repeats once. And that, I think, also is that's also an interesting songwriting technique. There's lots of I noticed this more in the demo too, but there's lots of just like Niden really likes to shift their chord voicings mid-riff. There's never they'll try things that are quite different from what a lot of modern guitars will do because they're not simply sliding down the neck with the same chord shapes. There's a real, and something I'll come back to, is there's a real resistance to inertia in this songwriting.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes down to the structuring of these songs is so it's so sort of liquid and organic. Weird numbers of repetitions of phrases, really intense contrast, but not sort of like random feeling. Like, look at that little bridge interrupter between the repetitions of the big melodic riff that you pointed out is like a Marduk riff that hadn't been written yet in 97.
Yes.
Yeah, because that's like a sophisticated thing that they would do on Panzer Division, but that wouldn't come out for a couple more years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like the more interesting songs at the end of Panzer Division. But yeah, that is a extremely sick riff.
Yeah, it's... and the whole discography is like this. Niden has this reputation of being this incredibly true and raw cult black metal thing, which is true, but any of these songs are just as sophisticated as any other very sophisticated material coming out at the same time. So
yeah.
So let me go over to another one.
That's probably one reason it's also not as popular, right? When people want something that has this war metal aesthetic, a lot of the time what they actually want is something that's retarded.
Yeah, they actually want grindcore.
Or Revenge, right?
Yeah, it's like...
This is a band that looks like Revenge, but delivers an extremely different feeling.
Yeah, this is too smart for dumb guys and too dumb for smart guys.
Yes.
So we're gonna go back in time a little bit to a track called Blackwater. This is off. I'm using the demo version of this. That is included on this discography. So the Niden Division's Towards Judgment is a demo and an EP in 96, and it appears that the EP version is just the demo version remixed. I'm using the demo version because I think it's extremely funny to point out that the original demo that Niden Division put out is by far the highest quality in terms of production, and they just steadily got worse as they continued. Like the EP remix makes it sound cloudier, and then Impergium is like even further down that rabbit hole. But it's kind of interesting because if you listen to this in the demo form with the higher fidelity, you can really pull out the sort of death metal quality of this stuff a lot easier.
Shot in the head and the chest. And he was laying there on the floor with a gun in his hand. He's still alive. Should have died.
So I think with the sort of louder, bassier, slightly clearer production, the death metal thing comes out a little bit more clearly. Something really interesting happens in that opening riff with that bizarre, descending, glassy phrase that concludes the riff. Switching from chording over to this just needling single note thing it strikes me as a very death metal technique, but the note choice is something that would come from Wolf Slayer Abyss era Mayhem or something.
think even from Demisteris. And I think from, like, Storm of the Lightsbane.
Perhaps. I am not as well acquainted with Storm of the Lightsbane as you, so I defer to you on that one.
Well, it's basically Storm of the Lightsbane. It doesn't negate the Mayhem connection you're making. When's Wolfslayer Abyss come out?
I think it's like right around the same time as this.
See, yeah, I would definitely say Wolfslayer Abyss is part of the same moment in Scandinavian black metal, right? Where they're like, you know...
Yeah, Wolfslayer Abyss is 97 also.
Right, they're all realizing, hey, once we strip back the devil stuff, what's left? Fascism.
Yeah.
So basically, it's definitely part of the same moment. Storm of the Lightsbane wasn't that far before this either. That might have been 96, but it was. But it's just a dissection-y thing. Basically, the black metal elements in dissection are extremely Mayhem influenced. Mm-hmm. But there's a particular dissection way of doing it that's a little more death metal-y and might also be a little more sort of grandiose and epic. Mm-hmm. And so I think you can kind of hear that here.
I'd also like to point out, again, back to the grindcore thing. Fascinating that sort of breakdown riff that occurs halfway through, that immediate lurching slowdown into this sort of like funereal Napalm Death doing the no wave thing type riff that sets up a sort of like funeral march slow black metal part, but no, the blast beat kicks back in under that sort of slow monotonous riff, which is a very grindcore technique. You know, black metal bands just weren't doing stuff like that in 97, and they really weren't doing it kind of at all until Orthodox starts picking up in the mid-2000s.
Oh yeah, you could hear Aosoth doing that. Or
yeah, definitely. Or just like DSO would do something like that. This is just a record that's very ahead of its time. Another thing that I wanted to mention while I was searching around for info about this band, it's amazing how little information there is about Niden Division, really, or about like the process of recording these. But apparently, sort of crypto friends of the show, Kayak, cite Niden as a major influence, which makes sense.
Yeah. That's like the only band that has ever talked about Niden as an influence. But
it kind of makes sense, and this connects to another point that I want to make is in that breakdown setup there is a sample, you know, in sort of the war metal tradition, and this is where I want to get into like the way Niden relates to war. You know, war is obviously a big topic in black metal, but Niden approaches it in a very death metal way where the emphasis is on killing and suffering. You know, the usual black metal take on war is war as a vehicle for sort of like elitism and the Ubermensch. You get what I'm saying? Sort of this.
I disagree. It's very focused on killing and suffering.
Well, yeah, but like
killing.
Well, killing, but usually not just in and of itself. You know.
I get what you mean in that this has a very naked sort of modern. Niden has a kind of like a modern, disenchanted, kind of active nihilist view towards these things, where they're looking at it in a very naked way. But at the same time, the kind of the whole point is that, like, in paganism or whatever, killing does just have a value in itself, right? It's just a whole ethical system that gives it a value.
Yes, but Niden Division appreciates it like a school shooter appreciates it.
Yes. Oh, yeah, no, I get what you mean. I think more like another way you could put it, I mean, yeah, it is very modern. There's not we're not talking about like ancient war and going mano a mano with swords. This is about, like, maybe that's a retard way of getting at it, but it does. The simplest way to distinguish Niden from their contemporaries is Niden were really interested in guns.
Yes, which seems silly, but I think is a crucial aesthetic difference. Gun black metal versus
that does connect it to death metal.
Yes, gun black metal versus sword black metal is there's an important thing that occurs in the late 90s, which is black metal guys getting into guns. You know, and you start seeing promo pictures with guys carrying guns rather than swords, which is not merely an aesthetic difference. There's an important distinction there, I believe.
Yeah, and you got to remember that in Europe also, like, I mean, obviously it's easier to get guns in Scandinavia than it is in, like, certain other parts of Europe, but, like, this is still, like, an American death metal band from Florida posturing with guns is, like, you know, one would kind of expect that, whereas these are Europeans going to considerable lengths to obtain firearms and brandish them.
Yes, and also
at a time when a lot of the people around them would have been like, "Dude, that's kind of weird."
Yeah, and also speaking to the modernist thing, in that interview with Fours, where he's the interviewer. This is on Chronicles of Chaos, a really cool old webzine. I don't think they're still active, but you know their shit's still mirrored and online. The interviewer is asking him, other bands that he would compare Niden to, and it was interesting. He was talking about the first In Battle record, if you're familiar with them.
I was actually thinking about them or Allegiance.
I'm only dimly familiar with In Battle. I definitely want to check them out now, after seeing him talk about it. But it's interesting because he draws a distinction in a very sort of teenager, early 20s way of like, I think In Battle is kind of musically similar, and they have songs about death and war and stuff, but they also have songs about, like, praising Odin and stuff, and I'm not into that. You know? There's definitely a sort of, like, simple but distinct ideological project at work in Niden Division. An aggressive sort of misanthropic nihilism that only sort of barely exists anymore.
Yes, it is. Yeah, Niden is resolutely modern. Some of these, I will say, In Battle, or who was the other one? There's a band called Allegiance who did famously have some very cool poses with guns.
Oh, that's tight. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. Again, they were also kind of a praise Odin kind of band, but were also in this musical and in the same sort of musical and cultural wave, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's go to one of yours.
All right. Judgment Dawns. This is, in a way, like, just playing your first sample, Genocide, is almost like the entire record.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and in a way, like, Genocide's basic set of, like, 4 or 5 riffs are so good that you could say that they're almost a cut above anything else on the rest of the record. But the rest of the record is awesome. So we'll go to, Judgment Dawns. And this is a short, grindy number with a couple really good riffs.
Holy fuck.
Yeah. Yeah. So that song almost works kind of as an explosive, aggressive coda to Genocide. Mm-hmm. I guess, really, if I had to say the record is just 2 songs, it's those 2 songs together.
Yeah, it's like the epic one and the grindcore one.
Exactly. And the grindcore one actually works as the climax. We've talked about this, about like a couple records this year where we're like, oh, they use the aggressive part as the climax.
Yeah, and Impergium has several instances of these songs working as kind of suites. And I'm gonna sample from a couple.
Oh, there's
later.
actually a pretty regular rhythm to it, isn't there? We've got Genocide to Judgment Dawns. We've got In the Twilight of War, which is a standalone. And then View in the Mirror Black goes to the Execution. Funeral Pyres, Gate. Yeah, they definitely work like that. So, Judgment Dawns is really cool. What I want to point out is the excellent way those 2 riffs set each other off. I love that. That's very death metal-y, kind of Morbid Angel-y.
Yeah.
And it's played with such a liquid groove. But it also has this... there's a sinister neoclassical element in it, even though it's one of the most deathy, grindy riffs on the record. Like, you can still hear a connection to the guitar work in Dawn or something.
Yeah. Well, this really makes me want to check out, because I don't know that I've ever listened to a Canaris quintet, and I really want to investigate them now.
It's cool. It's like big, glorious Melodeath.
Yeah, I'm just curious to check out, this guitarist, what other work he's done, because it seems so sophisticated, but he's not like a really prominent name.
Yeah. But yeah, the way the 2 phrases answer each other and reinforce each other is really cool. Basically, you have the kind of like fast, you have the kind of whiplash riff at the beginning, and then those chords, da 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 da. Just very cool call and response, with a really organic link between the 2 melodies. And other than that, the song just has like one nasty tension builder riff, and that's it. That's the whole song.
Yeah. Other death metal link, the classic Charles Manson sample that has been used in probably 700 death metal songs historically. Yeah. The if I started killing people, there wouldn't be none of you left, which is classic. It should be a feature of every extreme metal record, I think.
Yes. The samples are very important on this record.
Yes, they are.
Yes.
Yeah, relating back to that grindcore thing, the samples are never they're never generals at the table. It's always people talking about injuries or just gunfire and screaming or just sort of nihilistic phrases like that. They pop up pretty regularly.
Yeah, a lot of it seems like it's been carefully sampled from American like military movies.
Yeah, it's there's a real pronounced grimness to this that I just really, really enjoy. And again, it doesn't seem that... Okay, so executing this to this level of sophistication is challenging, but executing the basic conceit of this music isn't too difficult. And imagining how everyone who's exposed to Niden Division really likes it, can we get some Zoomers in the chat doing this, please? Can you guys jump away from your fucking vampire music about your ex-girlfriend stuff and do some shit like this?
Somebody clone this band.
Yes, please.
The only thing this is really comparable to, just free associating from that, the only thing this is really comparable to is Axis of Advance's Strike.
Oh yeah,
which also puts a lot of weight on gunfire samples.
Yeah, Strike is like the hyper sophisticated version of Niden.
Yeah, it's the brother from another mother, man. The Canadians.
Yeah, and it's also at least lightly comparable to certain like ugly, raw, misanthropic, like USBM stuff that was coming out in the early 2000s.
Like a Versifera, or
not necessarily that. More like Gansmord stuff, like really forgotten shit. You know,
oh, yeah,
just
I got no fucking clue.
just
Yeah.
like just total Kraft's fuck the universe type stuff. Just like
I don't know. I think Kraft's Fuck the Universe was pretty bad.
well, yeah, no. I mean the vibe.
Right. Okay,
Yeah. No, I don't like later Kraft. Actually, some of my old bandmates turned me on to the first Kraft record, which is actually extremely good. Total Soul Rape. That's a really good, weird album.
Great title.
Oh yeah, it's like doomy. It's like really slow and weird. A lot of it. It sounds almost like weird Portuguese dungeon stuff a lot of the time. But anyway. Let's get to your next sample, which is actually the one track that gets re-recorded from the demo for the full length, which I thought was interesting.
Yes. So this is I think you could also divide up Impergium into things that are recognizably Niden riffs and things that are more typically this circle of Swedish black metal riffs. Mm-hmm. So In the Twilight of War is a fantastic song. I didn't sample it. The song is really more than the sum of its parts. It's a bunch of, for the most part, very Swedish sounding, grandiose Swedish black metal riffs that very few of which stand on their own. They kind of turn into one another. There's kind of a barnstormer in the middle of the song. But for the most part, it hits this kind of elevated plateau and just stays there in an interesting way, exchanging one riff after another. But that's the closest you would get to a song that all the way through feels like Dawn or Dissection or something. And there are a few more like that, too. I feel like Gate is faster and grindier, but still feels more like it could be Marduk.
I think it's supposed to be Hate. He just typoed it.
Oh, wait, yeah, that's right. It was called Hate. I remember listening. I was like, why is it called Gate? Okay. I'm just thinking of Hate Forest.
Well, as you always do.
Yeah, well, that's my next sample. Anyway, but so, for this one, A View in the Mirror Black, this one is Niden riffs. And again, when you hear this, you'll just be like, oh, that's a Niden riff? That's every riff now. So yeah, then they just play that one riff again.
So something, it occurred to me, something that's interesting, something that makes this, like, distinct. Like, we talked about how this is kind of like a crypto DSBM record, which is true. But here's the thing. So that riff, that sort of pretty two-chord riff that's, like, very DSBM... it starts and ends the track. Yeah, it's an important decision is made. They don't do vocals over it, which I think is something that's sort of important on this album. The vocal performance on this record is, one, extremely good and fucking wild. It's sort of like Hat from Gorgoroth, but his voice, like, breaks in a DSBM style more.
I was going to talk about that. Yeah, you can hear that really well towards the end of this track.
Yeah, and it sounds awesome.
He is really not worried about being cool.
Yeah.
Here. It's constantly in the red.
But I think an important decision is made in that not doing vocals over the sort of, like, sweetest and saddest riffs keeps them sort of impersonal. You know, I think that something happens when you start doing vocals over that. You start wanting to write lyrics that are sad. And that's not what this is about. There is a sense of, like, sorrow and bitterness and desolation across this record, but it's kept deliberately inhuman by not having a voice interact with it. I mean, this is kind of bong-rippy. This is kind of bong-rippy.
No, that's a good point, buddy.
Yeah, so I think that's an important
putting
distinction.
The vocals behind something, it intentionalizes it, right? You're like, it makes it, it attaches, the riff becomes attached to the persona of the band or the front man. It becomes, and it also just gives it a certain emphasis in a song, right? Like in metal, we're used to waiting for the vocals to come in. The main part, the kill riff, is the part where the vocals come in. Right? Yeah. And then, there will be vocals on the kill riff and the chorusy part, which are marked as the center. So here, yes, it's more like it sort of pans away from the action and zooms out over the battlefields or the ruined cities, the refugee camps, the charnel houses, and it's like, yes, all of this is very sad. Now back to the shooting. Yeah,
because the center of this is in the shooting. But what's also interesting is in the shooting riffs, especially it comes out very clearly on this song. The chording of all this sort of middle material where the action is happening here is super weird. Like, there are these very gray, sort of neutral melodic phrases that you can't really ascribe a specific mood to. But they also don't sound, sort of conflicted or emotionally erratic. There is a deeply impersonal, mechanized quality to it. I think that middle material is the stuff that most reflects the cover of Impergium. The sort of like bombed out industrial World War I or II landscape that I think is just one of my favorite covers, actually, for a metal record ever.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
It's so sick. But I really like that, and that actually works really well going into my next sample. So we're gonna go from the Execution into Funeral Pyres, and I think that these go really well together. I think a really important thing, which we sort of touched on talking about A View in the Mirror Black, is the importance of long stretches of just instrumental material on this album. There's three short tracks that are purely instrumental, the Execution being one of them, and I don't know. I think that it's really... I think the structure of this album is really fascinating, and I think it speaks to, one, as you suggested, a lack of rules being consolidated over how extreme metal records were supposed to be formatted, as well as, like, a real intentionality and a consideration of flow. And also just pointing again to the sort of, like, crazed process of writing and recording this in 2 weeks. I think that's sort of how you get stuff like this, and I think it's very, very effective at communicating the whole mood. So the execution is just about a minute and change long. It's a little instrumental interrupter before Funeral Pyres starts. But it clearly leads into Funeral Pyres very cleanly. And between these two, I mean, that sample was pretty much entirely instrumental. That's about 2.5 minutes of just purely instrumental music. At no point on this record does Niden Division feel the need to rush getting vocals involved in the mix. The vocals are placed where they belong very deliberately, and there is not a fixation on vocals as being an essential part of the whole presentation like there is largely in metal bands. Which I think is very important. And at no point do you as a listener feel like you're waiting for the vocals to come in, like you said. This is music that works extremely well instrumentally and maintains your attention the entire time. And I think this has something to do with the relatively novel structure of this album, because, you know, sitting down and listening to it very intentionally several times, like I did for this sort of overview of the band, I was struck by how much I like the way this record is structured. I like the small instrumental tracks. There's songs that are very concrete songs in the way that we understand them, and things that are just sort of small things to touch on that lead into or out of larger compositions. And I think the overall result is something that hangs together extraordinarily well. And I think that metal bands, especially black and death metal bands, have been struggling for a long time with, how do we execute on making something that feels like an entire like, bespoke composition from beginning to end. And we've seen plenty of experiments of doing, like, single song albums, just these gargantuan kinds of things, and some of them have been really cool, but I think it's largely more trouble than it's worth. I think you actually get the same or better an effect with much less sort of like agonizing work by structuring it like this. And I think that Niden's willingness to play around with the boundaries of how we think black metal songs are structured is like one of the best aspects of the record, because this is an album that just feels perfectly contiguous from beginning to end. You know, it is a single unbroken chain, and its relative brevity has something to do with it. Impergium itself is only like 27 minutes long, but I think that it works better as a 27-minute song than most 27-minute songs do, you know?
Yeah. Yes, how do you make... Yes, by breaking out of the here's a sequence of 8 6-minute songs thing, that's how you get to something that feels more like a seamless whole that is also, like, also allows people to, like, skip to tracks and, not and isn't conducive to like bloat, as you said. I think the structure is very cool. It's a good way of making use of the fast, jammy way they wrote it. Right?
Yeah.
Like, because if you're writing a lot of stuff very rapidly and probably doing a lot of it, like trying it out rapidly in the rehearsal room, what you will end up with is scraps that don't necessarily stand on their own as a full-length epic song, but that could work productively with other parts of the same songwriting sessions and jams. And that maybe did, like, I wouldn't be crazy surprised, right, if just say, like, he literally wrote the riffs to Judgment Dawns after Genocide, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're just sitting down riffing, okay, I'm going to come up with this highly contrasting, aggressive grinding riff now. They're like, well, that might be its own song. They're like, that's a good point. Okay, let's make it 90 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, it really sort of
forces you to think more functionally about what a song is. You're not trapped in the form. Instead, you're making the form work for you. You're like, what? Instead of like, I have to fill this amount of space, it's like, what can I do with... I have 2 minutes of music that seem to hang together. What can I get it to do?
Yes, and it points to untapped potentials within the grindcore format. Because there really is no... I mean, there is an unspoken rule, but there's no literal rule that says, hey, if I just have these 2 cool riffs that go together, why can't they just be a very short song? And let's just stick it next to a larger, more involved composition and see what happens. You know, this is one of those cases where, you know, everything creatively is a trade-off. And we see that really distinctly in the evolution of a musical genre. You know, by disposing of some of the really sort of off-the-cuff, kind of pointless stuff that we would see on some older records, we've gotten things that are probably like largely more sophisticated, but we've also painted ourselves into a corner structurally on certain stuff. And I think that a record like this really reveals how even now, this record is approaching 30 years old now. Jesus Christ, don't say that too loudly. 30 years on, it's still doing things that most bands aren't willing to do. Out of some weird sense that's just not how things are done. But this proves that you can do them that way, and the effect can be incredible.
So while we're talking about the overall structure of the record, I actually had this dovetails well with the thing I noticed. A question I had listening is, some of the material on the demo is so fucking good. You're like, why didn't they also put this on the full length, right? So specifically the one you already sampled, which was Black Water. Black Water is just awesome all the way through. Your sample actually cut off at another great one of those sort of proto-French sounding riffs. The other one, which I'm going to sample, Towards Judgment, is also really... I can use this to segue, I guess. Towards Judgment is really, really good. But why aren't they on the record? And I think I've looked at the track length. It's because they're longer than any standalone track on Impergium. I think Genocide is kind of the centerpiece song on the record. Maybe In the Twilight of War is a little bit longer. How long is that? That is...
that's one of the longer ones.
About 340. It's about 340, which is about the same length as Blackwater and Towards Judgment. So there was actually, Towards Judgment is almost 4 minutes. So they really decided, we are not going to stick these epics on. Because we are trying to go for a more condensed thing where every track is interacting with the tracks around it. Which is a really daring and cool decision. It also helps explain why the definitive edition is the one that has those songs on it, because they're really good. But they're closer to standalone black or death metal epics. Whereas nothing on the album works like that.
Yeah, the material on Towards Judgment is still very distinct and weird, but closer to an understood paradigm of, like, black and death metal than the stuff on Impergium.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, with that in mind, let's listen to one more track. This is Towards Judgment, which was also the title of the demo. Again, the original demo mix. And we're going to start it in the middle, just before a pretty interesting dramatic song structure thing happens. Roman Senko? Is that you?
I think you really nailed something that I had never considered, which is, like, the very intentional change that occurs between the EP and the full length. Because again, like, listening to that's again, we can hear the dissection in proximity there much more clearly there than on the Impergium material.
Yeah, we drop in on that really sort of gorgeous soaring melodic riff, right? That's closer to something from Canorus or Dawn too. Yeah. Yeah, and this song has a bit of an epic conceit in that it has the mid-song dropout.
Yeah, and it's so cool. And I've never noticed the bassist just sort of like plucking around.
He just fucks around. Yes.
It's so cool.
Yeah, you can, and actually between that and the EP version, you hear different aspects of it. you can hear some of the plonking more clearly on the EP version. He really is just playing random shit. You can hear the pick scrapes. And then just boom on the dime. They're in. But yeah, and you can also hear that riff sounds that sounds insanely fun to play. And it has the sort of octave drone effect that would, become huge with Hate Forest, and you can really hear. I mean, that's the closest Niden gets towards anything that sounds like truly folky or sword-oriented. It has that sort of triplet folk dance groove to it, but which might be another reason why they left it off in Pergium. Right?
Yeah,
just like too black metal-y.
What's fascinating is like listening to this all put together. It's like you can hear two different bands here. Two different bands that could have carried on, with, the Towards Judgment material that could have carried on as a sophisticated but extremely aggressive Swedish black metal band. And then Impergium, I mean, we never got to hear that second full length. Would that have just become like full-fledged experimental, like black grind material?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, maybe they would have added, I think they would have added industrial sort of breakbeat shit.
I think it would make complete sense. That's the weird thing. It's like within the discography of this band, despite how short it is, there's just this unbelievable wealth of ideas that have never really been fully explored by anyone else. And it really makes me want to pick up my guitar.